the thing that makes it odd is that this appears to be the work of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Bridge Colby. Because of the way the administration has organized itself, we don't really have a national security advisor. That's who would normally coordinate all the different agencies and departments of the government on a big policy decision. After the president sacked Mr. Waltz, Secretary of State Rubio was given the additional job of being the national security advisor. Well, that's a ridiculous organizational move. And it looks to me that Mr. Colby made the decision to do this. He's been a strong anti-Ukraine guy now for several years. It doesn't look like Secretary of Defense, his boss, is aware of it or was involved in it.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're discussing the war in Ukraine with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges served for 38 years in the US Army, commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. Now, if you are listening to us, you can also subscribe to us on YouTube and get a membership for Frontline for Times Radio. And you can also, of course, listen to us across your favourite podcast outlets. It's Times Radio's Frontline. Ben Hodges, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks once again for the privilege, Louis.
We have heard in the last few days that the US is halting a lot of the pledged American weapons supplies to Ukraine. Does this look like it's going to be a permanent decision from America?
It's hard to say. Obviously, this is a terrible decision that is going to directly lead to the loss of innocent Ukrainian lives, because what we're talking about are air defense weapons. And this is the thing that Ukraine has been pleading for, just to protect their own innocent civilians. So I think it's a dreadful policy decision, and correctly is getting a lot of heat from Capitol Hill, from Republicans and Democrats. Now, the thing that makes it odd is that this appears to be the work of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Bridge Colby. Because of the way the administration has organized itself, we don't really have a national security advisor. That's who would normally coordinate all the different agencies and departments of the government on a big policy decision. After the president sacked Mr. Waltz, Secretary of State Rubio was given the additional job of being the national security advisor. Well, that's a ridiculous organizational move. And it looks to me that Mr. Colby made the decision to do this. He's been a strong anti-Ukraine guy now for several years. It doesn't look like Secretary of Defense, his boss, is aware of it or was involved in it. It doesn't look like the Secretary of State / National Security Advisor Rubio was aware of it. I'm not even sure that the president was aware of it. So this is not the first time that decisions have been made inside the Department of Defense that had to be reversed. So I'm hoping that there will be enough noise and heat that they will undo this and fix it. But it really is, not only is it just dysfunctional, but it also is it leads to the death of innocent people.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't suggest, considering the words we heard from Donald Trump at the NATO summit last week, talking about we're going to try and find more of these Patriot missiles, it doesn't suggest too much joined up thinking in the US administration, does it?
No, zero. There hasn't been a strategy. Now, to be fair, the Biden administration also did not have a strategy with a desire to end state. And I thought it was pretty rich that Jake Sullivan wrote an article yesterday condemning the Trump administration for holding off on the weapons delivery. But the fact is, the only strategy that the Trump administration actually brought in was, we want to get a deal. I can end it in 24 hours. And now they discovered that this is really, really hard, and they want to move on to something else. So this is not just bad policy. It's dangerous, and maybe the most dangerous aspect for the United States, stand fast, innocent people in Ukraine, is people are going to really doubt whether or not the United States is a reliable ally. Do we deliver what we promised? Do we live up to our agreements? That's bad for the United States. I don't know how this makes America great again.
And the official reason given is that the US is worried about their military stockpiles. I mean, are you aware of any shortages in the US? And how long does it usually take for the US military industry to produce more of these weapons? I'm thinking artillery shells all the way up to the more advanced missiles and Patriot batteries.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we don't have enough of a lot of weapons. In Patriot, the interceptors in particular, those are they take a long time to produce. But I'm not aware that the Trump administration began work on this, 6 months ago to try and increase the production capacity. Um, if this is about hanging on to things for China, most of the other stuff that we're talking about would not be relevant to China. Only the Patriot, but they didn't even say it that way. And again, I think that's the cover story. They just This administration has been placating Russia from day one, and Mr. Colby has been a very strong anti-Ukraine uh, voice, if you will, from way before he assumed the position of USDP. That's Undersecretary of Defense Policy, which is like the number three position in the Pentagon. And it's this is a reflection that they don't care about Ukraine. They are placating Russia, and they don't understand or don't care that what is happening with Ukraine and Russia. Not only is that bad for America's economy, because this war is disrupting Europe's economy, which affects us, since Europe is our largest trading partner as a bloc. And then also, the Chinese are watching. The Chinese see that we are dysfunctional, that we're not a reliable ally, and that we seem to be kind of flexible on this sovereignty thing based on our pressure on Ukraine to come on give up Crimea. Um, I think this sends the wrong signal of weakness to the Chinese, who supposedly are the biggest threat.
And you mentioned Europe there. Of course, Europe is also a big supporter, especially nations like Germany, of Ukraine. Is there going to be a level of frustration, do you think, in Kiev that Europe, despite saying they were going to step up and fill in some of the boots that America was fill in some of that support America was providing, it's just not quite there yet?
Yeah, of course they'll be frustrated. Germany, I think, is. I'm very pleased to see what the German Chancellor is doing, Mr. Merz, but even he is still waffling around on Taurus. He said, I saw yesterday, he said it'll take 6 months to train the Ukrainians on how to use it. Germany is not going to be a party to the war. Now, of course, I'm not naive. He's under pressure inside his own very somewhat fragile coalition, but when you start coming up with excuses for how long it takes to train, that's the same nonsense that we were hearing during the Biden administration as well. So, frankly, I was disappointed in that. I do sense that countries are going to invest in Ukraine's defense industry, which is not a bad thing, to help them grow their own ability to create weapons, especially long-range precision weapons. I think about 40% of what Ukraine uses now is what they make themselves. I see that only continuing to grow.
And a lot of that innovation within Ukraine will be crucial for them, especially in long range strikes. I mean, I'm thinking of the ongoing strikes on Russian industrial and oil infrastructure, but also, of course, thinking a little further back on military sites like airfields as well.
So this is what they're going to have to do. It doesn't matter to the Kremlin how many casualties they have. I mean, according to sources in UK, the Russians have passed the million casualty mark already. That's killed and wounded, a million in the last 3 years, and so 3.5 years for almost no gains. I'm willing to bet that the number is much closer to 2 million than it is 1 million, just based on reporting and lack of battlefield medical care on the Russian side. But nonetheless, that's not what's going to win the war. It's going to be targeting what you just described, Lewis. The oil and gas infrastructure. When Russia can no longer export oil and gas to China and India, they cannot continue to prosecute the war. I mean, 70% of what they export goes to those two customers, China and India. So if you can disrupt that, make it impossible for Russia to meet the demands whether it's going after the actual storage and transmission facilities in Russia, or as they did earlier this week to sabotage several of these tankers that were full of Russian oil to hit them out in the Aegean. I mean, this is what they're going to do. And then, of course, as they demonstrated in the Operation Spider's Web, their long strategic reach, that there is not 1 square kilometer of Russia that they can't touch. And I think they're going to have to continue doing that to erode Russia's ability to finance the war and then to prosecute the strikes against Ukrainian cities.
And last time there was this halt in US support, we saw a significant advance by the Russians in the Kursk region, retaking that area that Ukraine had seized within Russia. We've seen little progress recently elsewhere, especially in Russia's sort of summer offensive, which hasn't come to much yet. But should we be worried about there now being an opportunity for Russia to make breakthroughs or larger advances in the east?
Well, it depends what we're talking about here. It was the disruption of intelligence, I think, is what created a window when the Ukrainians were not able to see or understand what was happening a little deeper inside Russia. That's a different problem than if we cut off delivery of certain weapon systems, like air, especially air and missile defense. So, I've been hearing for years now about the next big Russian offensive or whatever. And what it looks to me, I could be wrong, but what it looks like to me is um, these are just big piles of unlucky infantry, some of whom are on motorcycles or on golf carts or that sort of thing. But it's still the same old of trying to overwhelm Ukrainian defenders. And you know, I don't mean to sound dismissive of it, but that's not going to win the war for Russia. I mean, it doesn't appear to me that they have the ability to break through and penetrate and then exploit it, because they don't have the mobile forces that could then go through that penetration. It's just like waves of people, thousands of whom are getting killed every week. But that's not a something that's going to decisively change the direction of the war. Nor is killing innocent Ukrainians going to lead. That's not decisive. But both of these things that the Russians are doing are part of an overall genocide effort to destroy Ukraine as a state and the idea of Ukraine as a state. That's awful. If you're a Ukrainian soldier in trenches outside Pokrovsk or fighting hard up in Sumy or something like that, or if you're a civilian that lives in Kherson or Kharkiv or even Kiev. But this is not a war-winning strategy for Russia unless we all quit, we, the United States and Europe. And that's what the Russians are counting on, is that we just won't do what needs to be done, either economically or materially.
Well, meanwhile, in the US, we've seen the confirmation of Lieutenant General Alexis Grinkovich to lead US European Command. He's told the Senate he believes Ukraine can win the war, a bit different from what people are saying elsewhere in the US administration at the moment. What do you make of his appointment?
Well, interesting. He's I think his grandparents immigrated from what is today Belarus. So it's a great American tradition of immigrants and generations after serving in the military. The statement that he made, his statement probably would not have been pleasing to everybody in the administration, because it runs counter to the Trump, that awful day he had with President Zelensky in the Oval Office when he said, "You got no cards," meaning there's no way you can win. Why would you start a war with Russia, who's so much bigger? Which again showed the lack of understanding of why people fight in this administration. So I was very happy to hear Grinch is his Air Force call sign that he goes by, as you could understandably said that he does think that Ukraine can still win. General Cavoli said that a couple of months ago when he was doing testimony, who was the previous Supreme Allied Commander. And so, Ukraine could have won 2 years ago if the U.S., UK, Germany, France, other countries had decided this is in our best interest that they defeat Russia. And here you go. Instead of this nonsense of we're with you for as long as it takes, which is an empty political statement. So anyway, I think we'll see. Does he get scuffed up by his new boss, the Secretary of Defense, or somebody, um, or who's really running things there? It's just not clear.
And I want to come back to the front line in Ukraine now, because Russia has claimed earlier this week that it's taken full control of the Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine. Kiev intelligence says, though, that this has cost them, over 1 million soldiers to get to the point they're at in this conflict now. Is that cost worth it from a military perspective?
Well, for the Russians, again, they don't care about casualties. When I say they, of course, I'm talking about Putin and the top leadership. The Russians never actually cared that much about casualties, with some exceptions. Um, it was all, that was their main tactic, has always been to try and just overwhelm defenders, going back all their wars. So is it worth it for them? I don't know. At the end of the day, um, if that's your victory, is that you capture all of Luhansk, which you claimed you had annexed 2 years ago anyway. That's kind of hard to spin that into a winning message. But again, we're not talking about UK or US or some other Western democratic country. We're talking about a place where um, what the people think is not of huge concern to the government.
And I suppose we're talking about Russia's mentality here. The one thing we haven't discussed so far is the message that halt in US support sends to US adversaries. And I'm not just thinking about the Kremlin, I'm also thinking about China, of course.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I didn't do it very well earlier, is that the failure of the administration to realize that what's happening in Ukraine is not an isolated incident. It's not some island somewhere, that the Chinese are watching, as are other adversaries, to see, excuse me, the Chinese and other adversaries are watching and can see that perhaps the United States is not a reliable ally, does not have the political will to do what needs to be done, and is more interested in getting a deal somewhere, a transaction that benefits the United States, so such as a minerals deal or oil or markets or something, versus standing up for things such as the rule of law, for sovereignty, for freedom of navigation, all the things that are at stake in Ukraine, and with Russia's attack on Ukraine. The Chinese can see that you know we may not be that serious about sovereignty. When Secretary Rubio said, "Come on, Ukraine, you're going to have to give up some land," and that was at the beginning of the so-called negotiations. Well, the Chinese will see that and say, "Okay, maybe they'll be flexible on Taiwan also." And certainly the Taiwanese would be very anxious, as would Japan and South Korea, the Philippines, others who might see that the U.S., that this administration, I should be clear, would not be willing to do everything necessary to live up to any sort of agreement. And then when the aid can be turned on and off like this, that that will also have have an impact on the American defense industry, because customers will realize. I mean, I've heard this already from members of parliament in another European country. They're very concerned about could the U.S. just unilaterally degrade or turn something off of a very expensive weapon system. That's bad for American business. So I don't understand the thinking here.
And of course, there's also other allies of Russia. North Korea, in particular, is really trying to solidify their alliance with the Kremlin at the moment. They're pledging roughly 30,000 more men to Russia's cause. Some of those it may be going into civilian roles within Russia, but there will be thousands going into Russia's war effort. Is that number significant, though, given Russia's attrition rate?
Well, I think it is significant. I don't know how they're all going to be used. I've heard that some of these were going to be troops, some of these were going to go work in factories, but that does tell you about the manpower shortage that even Russia is having to deal with. And North Korea seems to be the most willing ally. Iran is not going to be able to contribute much anymore. And in fact, the Iranians, I think, are shifting their approach to China because they saw that Russia did nothing to help them here over the last several weeks against Israel or the U.S. Russia, by the way, did nothing to help Armenia. They did nothing to help Assad except give him a Moscow apartment. And now they've done nothing to help Iran. So Russia also turning out to be an unreliable ally. Um, so I don't know how these things are going to finally fit together, but I would not say it's inconsequential that North Korea might be able to fill some manpower gaps.
And we've been talking a lot about, well, unreliable allies here, really, today, Ben. What do you think Ukraine's answer to this is in the round strategically? If they can't rely as much on the US as they have been, and if Europe just isn't quite at the point, what do they do from an almost military strategic and I suppose national viewpoint?
So I think that Ukraine is, they can see that the U.S. is not going to be the answer to their long-term survival and security, unfortunately. At least not the way it looks now, despite what the president said at The Hague last 2 weeks ago. Um, Actions like turning off air defense weapons, that that's going to reinforce in their mind that they can't trust the U.S. Europe has talked a lot of European countries, including UK, have talked a lot about doing things, but the actual quantity of stuff is not going to be enough to replace, make up the difference of what the U.S. Was and should be providing. So I think the Ukrainians are probably going to adopt something like what the Israelis do. They will become the Israel of Eastern Europe with a strategy of denial. And what by that, even though they won't have a nuclear weapon the way the Israelis do, the Ukrainians are going to be, I think they're going to accept they're in a constant state of war. Constant state of war. That means they'll continue to grow their defense industry. They'll continue to try and strengthen their defenses everywhere they can. Um, they've demonstrated that there is no safe place anywhere in Russia for Russians. I mean, they can reach every square kilometer, as we saw back during Operation Spider's Web, both inside Russia, but also wherever Russia has assets, like these oil tankers, the so-called shadow fleet vessels that were hit out in the Aegean. So I think Ukraine is going to go after the oil and gas infrastructure, airfields, Navy bases, and other Russian strategic assets. They're going to continue to go after them to wreck Russia's ability to export oil and gas. And also, much like the Mossad, I think the GUR is going to be hunting down senior Russian officers, the way the Mossad goes after Hezbollah leadership and those inside the Iranian regime. I anticipate this is what Ukraine is going to do. And that means that every senior Russian officer for the rest of his life is going to be looking over his shoulder or checking under his car every morning.
Well, Ben Hodges, former commander, US Army Europe, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
I always appreciate the opportunity, Lewis. Thank you.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.